Welcome back to Revenge Room, the channel where betrayal meets justice, and the truth always finds its way to the surface. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button because today's story will leave you speechless. Today's story is called, "Don't Come Alone, Bring Your Son and His Wife," the contractor said while fixing my late wife's office. They say the dead cannot speak. But what if your late wife found a way to protect you from beyond the grave? What if she knew about the betrayal happening right under your roof and spent her final months building a trap so perfect that the people who wronged you would walk straight into it? 1 year after losing the love of my life, I decided to renovate her old office. I thought it would bring me closure. I thought I was ready to move on. I was praying at church when my phone rang. It was the contractor. His voice was strange, almost nervous. He said, "Sir, I need you to come home right now. We found something behind the wall. But don't come alone. Bring your son and his wife." Those words changed everything. When I arrived and saw what was hidden inside that wall, my heart nearly stopped. But it wasn't what I found that destroyed me. It was the look on my daughter-in-law's face. She smiled. She recognized what we found. And then we kept digging and we found something else, something she didn't know about. That smile disappeared forever. If you skip ahead or leave now, you will miss one of the most incredible revenge stories ever told. My wife didn't just leave me memories. She left me a weapon. Stay until the very end because the twists coming will shock you and the ending will have you cheering out loud. My name is George Halbrook. I'm 64 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 40 years designing bridges and highways across Colorado. I built structures meant to last generations, yet I could not build anything strong enough to keep my wife from slipping away. It has been 1 year since Helen passed, and I'm still learning how to breathe in a house that no longer feels like home. Every morning I wake at 6, not because I need to, but because Helen always did. I make coffee the way she liked it, strong with a little honey, even though I prefer mine black. I water her plants by the kitchen window, the ones she called her little survivors, because they thrived despite my neglect whenever she traveled. I keep her reading glasses on the nightstand right where she left them, as if she might reach for them in the middle of the night. These rituals are not about logic. They are about holding on to the last pieces of her that I can still touch. Our home sits on a quiet ridge outside Boulder, surrounded by pine trees and silence. Helen chose this place 30 years ago. She said the mountains reminded her that some things were built to endure. I used to tease her about being sentimental. Now I understand. When you lose someone, you cling to anything that feels permanent. Lucas and Sabrina visit occasionally. My son is 36 now, a financial consultant in Denver, married for 8 years to a woman who smiles perfectly and says all the right things. They come for lunch once a month, sometimes less. Sabrina always has somewhere else to be. A work emergency, a friend's birthday, a dinner reservation they cannot miss. Lucas follows her lead, apologizing with his eyes while his feet carry him toward the door. I tell myself that grief affects everyone differently. I tell myself they are busy building their own lives, but late at night when the house is too quiet, I wonder if they are avoiding me or avoiding something else entirely. Helen's home office is the one room I have not entered since she died. It sits at the end of the hallway door, closed frozen in time. She spent hours there during her final months organizing papers, making phone calls I was never invited to hear. I assumed she was handling her affairs, tying up loose ends the way practical people do. I never pushed. I thought I was giving her space. Now I wonder if I was simply afraid to know what she was doing. Last week I decided it was time. Not to forget Helen, but to find a way forward that does not feel like drowning. I called a contractor named Ronald Pierce, recommended by a friend from church. I explained that I wanted to renovate the office, maybe turn it into a reading room or a small library, something peaceful, something new. Ronald came by to assess the space, and I found myself standing in the doorway while he measured walls and checked the foundation. The room looked exactly as Helen left it. Books aligned perfectly on the shelves, desk drawers labeled in her neat handwriting, a thin layer of dust on the windowsill, the only evidence that time had passed at all. It struck me then how deliberate everything looked. Helen was never this organized. She used to joke that her chaos was creative, but this room felt different. It felt prepared. As I watched Ronald work, a memory surfaced unbidden. 2.5 years ago, Helen sat me down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and told me she was sick. She said she had known for a week. I remember asking who told her which doctor what test. She changed the subject. She talked about treatment options, about staying positive, about the trip to Italy we never took, but she never answered my question. I always wondered who told her first. I wondered why it mattered enough to hide. Standing in that office, surrounded by her careful arrangements, I felt the question return. Helen kept secrets. Small ones, I always assumed. The kind wives keep to protect their husbands from worry. But looking at those perfect shelves, those labeled drawers, I was no longer certain. I didn't know it then, but this room was never meant to stay closed. Helen had made sure of that long before she took her final breath, and the secrets she left behind were about to change everything I thought I knew about my family. Ronald Pierce returned 3 days later with his tools and a quiet confidence that immediately put me at ease. He was a man in his early 50s, broad-shouldered with hands that showed decades of honest work. When he shook my hand at the door, his grip was firm but not aggressive, the kind of handshake that belongs to someone who has nothing to prove. He wore a simple flannel shirt and work boots that had seen better years, and he carried himself with the steady patience of a man who understood that some jobs required more than hammers and nails. What struck me most was how comfortable he seemed in my home. He walked through the hallway toward Helen's office as if he had been here before, pausing at the right doorways, turning at the correct corners without hesitation. I told myself I was imagining things. Grief does strange work on the mind, making ordinary moments feel loaded with meaning. Ronald was simply a professional who had studied the layout during his first visit. There was nothing unusual about his familiarity. And yet as I followed him down that hallway, I could not shake the feeling that he had arrived exactly when I needed him, as if some invisible hand had guided him to my door. The office looked different in the morning light. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust particles that floated like tiny ghosts above Helen's desk. I stood in the doorway while Ronald moved through the space, his eyes scanning every surface with the careful attention of someone cataloging evidence. He ran his fingers along the built-in bookshelves that covered the entire back wall floor to ceiling, packed with volumes Helen had collected over 40 years. Novels, history books, engineering manuals she borrowed from me, and journals filled with her handwriting. Every spine was aligned, perfectly arranged, not by author or subject, but by height, creating a visual symmetry that bordered on obsessive. I found myself staring at those shelves with fresh eyes. Helen was many things, but meticulous was never one of them. She left coffee cups on windowsills, forgot to close cabinet doors, and piled magazines on every available surface until I threatened to build her a second living room. Her creativity thrived in disorder. She used to say that a messy desk was the sign of an active mind. But this room told a different story. Every drawer was labeled in her careful script: tax documents, medical records, legal correspondence. The pens in her cup were sorted by color. The paperweights on her desk formed a perfect diagonal line. This was not the workspace of the woman I married. This was something else entirely. It felt staged, curated like a museum exhibit designed to communicate something specific to whoever entered. Ronald must have sensed my unease because he glanced over his shoulder and offered a small nod. "Beautiful room," he said. "She took good care of it." I wanted to tell him that this was not her kind of care. This was preparation. But the words stuck in my throat, so I simply nodded and let him continue his work. He moved toward the back wall, the one covered entirely by the bookshelves. His knuckles rapped against the wood in a slow, methodical rhythm, testing the structure beneath. I watched him work his way from left to right, his expression neutral, his focus absolute. Then about halfway across, he stopped. His hand hovered over a section of shelving near the middle, and his brow furrowed slightly. "That's strange," he said, more to himself than to me. I stepped closer. "What is it?" He knocked again, this time harder. The sound that returned was different from the others, hollow, empty. He moved his hand 3 feet to the right and knocked once more. The same hollow echo answered. "Here, Bo," he said, pointing to the first spot. "And here." He pointed to the second. "The rest of this wall is solid, standard construction, probably original to the house, but these 2 sections sound different, like there's empty space behind them." My stomach tightened. Could it be ductwork plumbing? Ronald shook his head slowly. "Wrong location for ducts, and there's no plumbing on this side of the house." He crouched down, examining where the bookshelf met the floor. His fingers traced along the baseboard, stopping at a seam I'd never noticed. "See this? The molding here is newer than the rest. Different grain, slightly different color. Someone added this after the original construction." I felt the room shift around me as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Helen had lived in this house for 30 years. She had chosen every paint color, every piece of furniture, every plant in the garden. If someone had modified this room, she would have known. She would have been the one to authorize it. Ronald stood brushing dust from his knees. He looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. Curiosity, perhaps, or something closer to recognition. "Mr. Halbrook," he said carefully, "this wall doesn't belong here. Someone added it after the house was built. And based on the materials, I'd say it was done sometime in the last 3 years." The last 3 years. Helen was still alive 3 years ago. She was still walking these hallways, still organizing these shelves, still keeping secrets. I was only beginning to glimpse. I asked Ronald to wait before investigating further. I needed time to think, time to process what he had told me about that wall. He agreed without pressing, simply nodding, as if he understood that some discoveries require preparation. We scheduled him to return on Monday, and I spent the weekend trying to convince myself there was an innocent explanation. Perhaps Helen had added storage space. Perhaps she had hidden Christmas gifts or old photographs she wanted to protect from humidity. Perhaps I was making something out of nothing. Sunday morning arrived with pale light filtering through my bedroom curtains. I dressed in my usual clothes for church, a simple button-down shirt and dark slacks, the same outfit I had worn every Sunday since Helen's funeral. Church had become my anchor in the year since she passed, not because I had suddenly found faith I never possessed, but because the ritual itself brought comfort. The wooden pews worn smooth by generations of hands, the stained glass windows casting colored shadows across the floor, the silence that asked nothing of me except presence. I arrived early as I always did and took my seat in the third row from the back. Helen and I used to sit closer to the front, but after she died I could not bear the thought of that empty space beside me being so visible. In the back, my solitude felt private rather than displayed. I bowed my head and folded my hands not to pray for answers, but simply for strength. I had learned over the past year that answers rarely came when demanded. Strength, however, could be summoned if you asked quietly enough. The service began, and I let the familiar words wash over me like water. The hymns rose and fell, voices blending into a single current of sound. For a brief hour, I forgot about hollow walls and labeled drawers and the strange perfection of Helen's office. I forgot about the questions multiplying in my mind like weeds in an untended garden. I simply existed, breathing in the incense-tinged air, letting the weight of the week slide from my shoulders. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. I ignored it at first. Whoever it was could wait. But the vibration came again, insistent, followed by a third pulse that told me someone was calling rather than texting. I slipped out of the pew as quietly as I could, shoes barely whispering against the stone floor, and stepped into the vestibule where the light was dim and the air smelled of old wood. The screen showed Ronald's name. I answered with a low voice, "Ronald, I'm at church. Is everything all right?" His reply came measured and careful, the voice of a man choosing his words with precision. "Mr. Halbrook, I apologize for disturbing you, but I came by this morning to take some measurements, and I started examining that wall more closely. I found something you need to see." My chest tightened. "What did you find?" A pause stretched between us, filled with static and the distant echo of hymns from the sanctuary behind me. "I think it's better if you see it yourself, sir. But Mr. Halbrook, I don't think you should come alone. You might want to bring your family." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Bring your family. Why would a contractor suggest such a thing? What could possibly be behind that wall that would require witnesses beyond myself? I thanked him and ended the call. My hands unsteady as I slipped the phone back into my pocket. The hymn inside had shifted to something slower, more mournful, and I stood in the vestibule listening to voices I could no longer chin. My mind was already racing backward through time, sifting through memories I had never thought to question. Sabrina asking about the house's layout during her first visit, her questions casual but specific. How many rooms, any storage spaces, did Helen have her own office? I had thought she was simply making conversation, showing interest in her future family. Now those questions felt like reconnaissance, Lucas deflecting whenever I mentioned his mother's final months. The way his eyes shifted when I asked if Helen had seemed worried about anything. The quick subject changes the nervous laughter, the sudden need to check his phone. I walked to my car on legs that felt borrowed from someone else. The drive home took 20 minutes, but I do not remember most of it. My hands knew the route while my mind replayed every small moment I had dismissed as insignificant. By the time I pulled into my driveway, a new emotion had begun to replace the grief I had carried for 12 months. It was sharper, colder, and far more dangerous. I called Lucas before stepping out of the car. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice carrying that distracted tone I had come to expect. "Dad, hey, what's up?" "Ronald found something in your mother's office," I said. "Something behind the wall. I think you and Sabrina should come over." Silence. Then carefully, "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet, but he said I should bring family. Can you come?" Another pause, longer this time. When Lucas finally spoke, his voice sounded different, strained, almost fragile. Yeah, we'll be there. Give us an hour." I ended the call and sat in my car, staring at the house where I had lived for 30 years. It looked the same as always, but everything had changed. Fear had replaced grief, and I realized I had been grieving alone for reasons I did not yet understand. Lucas and Sabrina arrived exactly 1 hour later, their silver sedan pulling into the driveway with the precision of people who had somewhere else they would rather be. I watched from the living room window as they stepped out of the car, Sabrina smoothing her blouse and checking her reflection in the side mirror while Lucas stood with his hands in his pockets, his shoulders tense beneath his jacket. They looked like a couple arriving at an obligation rather than a family gathering, and I noted this with the same detachment I had once used to assess structural flaws in aging bridges. I met them at the door with handshakes and brief embraces. Sabrina smiled warmly, her perfume filling the entryway with something floral and expensive. "Dad, it's so good to see you," she said, her voice carrying the practiced sweetness I had grown accustomed to over 8 years of holidays and birthdays. Lucas nodded behind her, his eyes already scanning the hallway as if searching for exits. Ronald was waiting in Helen's office, standing respectfully near the window, with his tools arranged neatly at his feet. I led my son and daughter-in-law down the hallway, and I felt the atmosphere shift as we crossed the threshold into that carefully organized room. Sabrina's gaze swept across the bookshelves, the desk, the labeled drawers, and I caught something flicker behind her eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Cognition. Or calculation. "Thank you all for coming," Ronald said, his voice steady and professional. "I wanted you to see this together because I think it's important." He gestured toward the back wall where he had already removed a section of the bookshelf to expose the paneling beneath. "There's a hidden compartment behind this wall. Mrs. Halbrook had it installed sometime in the last few years. I'm going to open it now." He worked carefully, using a pry bar to loosen the false panel that had been fitted so seamlessly into the original construction. The wood groaned softly as it separated from the frame, revealing a dark cavity that smelled of dust and something older, like secrets left too long in silence. Ronald reached inside and pulled out 3 items: a small fireproof safe, a manila folder thick with documents, and a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Helen's handwriting. I heard Sabrina inhale sharply beside me. When I glanced at her face, I saw something I had not expected. She was smiling. It was brief, barely a flicker at the corners of her mouth, but unmistakable. A smile of recognition, a smile of relief. She knew this safe. She had seen it before. The realization hit me like cold water. Sabrina was not surprised by what Ronald had found. She was relieved that this was all he had found. But Ronald was not finished. He set the first safe aside and reached deeper into the compartment, his arm disappearing up to the elbow. His expression shifted, curiosity replacing professionalism, and he said quietly, "There's more back here. Another section." Sabrina's smile vanished. Ronald pulled away a second panel, this one smaller and more carefully concealed than the first. Behind it sat another safe, identical in size, but different in one crucial way. This one had a combination lock rather than a key lock. This one had been hidden behind the hiding place itself. I watched Sabrina's face transform. The color drained from her cheeks. Her lips parted slightly and her eyes widened with something I recognized immediately because I had seen it countless times in courtrooms and boardrooms throughout my career. It was the expression of someone who had just realized they had been outmaneuvered. She did not know about this safe. She had never seen it. She had no idea it existed. Lucas looked between his wife and the wall with growing confusion. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice thin and uncertain. "Mom never mentioned any of this." Sabrina recovered quickly, smoothing her expression back into neutral concern, but I had already cataloged every micro-expression, every involuntary twitch. 40 years of engineering had taught me to notice details others overlooked: cracks in foundations, stress fractures in steel, the subtle signs that something was about to collapse. "I'm sure there's an explanation," Sabrina said, her voice a fraction too controlled. Helen was always private about her personal affairs. Maybe she just wanted to keep important documents safe. I said nothing. I simply looked at her, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. She met my gaze for a moment, then looked away, so suddenly fascinated by the pattern on the curtains. Ronald stood back, brushing dust from his sleeves. "I'll leave you to examine everything," he said. "But Mr. Halbrook, I think your wife went to a lot of trouble to make sure these things were found by the right person at the right time." He excused himself and left the four of us standing in that room, surrounded by Helen's perfect shelves and hidden compartments and the weight of truths not yet spoken. I looked at the sealed envelope with my name on it, then at the two safes sitting side by side like witnesses waiting to testify. Sabrina had come prepared to perform. She had rehearsed her reactions, planned her explanations, anticipated what we might find. She had not prepared for this. I asked Lucas and Sabrina to give me a moment alone with the envelope. My voice was calm when I made the request, but something in my tone must have conveyed that this was not negotiable. Lucas nodded quickly, relief washing over his features at the excuse to escape the tension. Sabrina hesitated, her eyes lingering on the sealed paper in my hands before following her husband out of the room. I heard their footsteps retreat down the hallway, heard the soft murmur of voices in the living room, and then I was alone with my wife's final words. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. I turned it over in my hand, studying Helen's handwriting, the way she had written my name with the same careful strokes she used for everything important. George, just my name, nothing else. No instructions, no explanations on the outside. Whatever she needed to say was waiting within. I slid my finger beneath the seal and opened it slowly, as if rushing might somehow damage what was inside. A single sheet of paper folded twice, filled with Helen's familiar script. The date at the top made my breath catch. She had written this 18 months before she died. 18 months of carrying whatever truth these pages contained, 18 months of looking at me across the breakfast table and choosing silence. My hands trembled as I began to read. "My dearest George," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then you have found what I left behind. I want you to know that everything I did to protect you and to protect our family. But protection sometimes requires secrets, and I'm sorry that I could not share this burden while I was alive." I had to stop. The words blurred, and I realized my eyes had filled with tears I had not felt coming. I wiped them away with the back of my hand and forced myself to continue. The day I was diagnosed, I saw her face, Sabrina's face. I had just come home from the doctor's office, still in shock, still trying to understand what the test results meant. I had not told anyone yet. I wanted time to process before I told you. But Sabrina was in the house that day, waiting for Lucas to finish a phone call. I left my purse on the kitchen counter while I went to the bathroom to compose myself. When I came back, she was standing near the counter with her phone in her hand and my purse was open. She said she had been looking for a pen. But I saw the way she looked at me when I entered the room. She was not sad, George. She was calculating. She had seen the medical paperwork in my purse. She knew before you did, before Lucas did, before anyone. I set the letter down for a moment, unable to continue. The image Helen described was so vivid, so terrible, that I could see it playing out in my mind like a scene from a film I never wanted to watch. Sabrina standing in our kitchen, my wife's private anguish spread before her like an opportunity. I picked up the letter again. I watched her over the following weeks. I saw how she began asking questions about the house, about our finances, about what would happen someday when we were gone. She thought she was being subtle. She thought I was too sick and too distracted to notice. But I noticed everything, George. I've always noticed everything about the people who might hurt the ones I love. I wanted to tell you. Every day I wanted to walk into your study and lay everything before you. But I knew what you would do. You would confront Lucas immediately. You would demand answers, issue ultimatums, draw lines in the sand. And you would lose your son. Not because Lucas is evil, but because he is weak, and weak people cling to whoever holds them tightest. Sabrina holds him tight, George. She has since the day they met. So I made a different choice. I gave her one chance to stop. I asked her to meet me for coffee, just the two of us, and I told her that I knew what she was doing. I told her that it was not too late to change course, that I would forgive everything if she simply stopped. She looked me directly in the eyes, George. She held my hand across the table and told me I was imagining things. She said my illness was making me paranoid. She said she loved Lucas and she loved our family and she would never do anything to hurt us. She lied without blinking. And that was when I knew what I had to do. The letter continued, explaining the hidden compartments, the safes, the careful documentation Helen had assembled over months of quiet observation. She wrote about hiring Ronald Pierce 2 years before her death, giving him specific instructions to wait until I decided to renovate her office. She wrote about meeting with an attorney named Judith Kramer, establishing what she called a safety net in case I never found the courage to open this room. If you are reading this within 18 months of my passing, then you found it yourself. I'm proud of you for that. If more time has passed, then Judith will have come to you because I made arrangements for her to do so. Either way, you were never meant to face this alone. There is one more thing. In my desk drawer beneath the false bottom, you will find another envelope. It is addressed to Lucas. Do not give it to him yet. Give it to him only when he is ready to hear what I could not say while I was alive. You will know when that time comes. A father always knows. I reached the final paragraph with my heart pounding against my ribs. I'm sorry, George. I'm sorry for the secrets and the silence and the burden I'm leaving behind. But I'm not sorry for protecting you. I'm not sorry for building walls to keep out those who would tear down everything we created together. If you are reading this, then I was right about her, and I'm sorry I could not tell you while I was alive. All my love forever and always, Helen. I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest. In the living room, I could hear Sabrina's voice, bright and artificial, filling the silence with chatter about traffic and weather. She had no idea that Helen had seen through her from the very beginning. She had no idea that she had been outmaneuvered by a dying woman who loved her family more than her own peace. I placed Helen's letter back in its envelope and tucked it into my jacket pocket close to my heart where it belonged. The weight of her words settled into my bones as I walked out of the office past the living room where Lucas sat staring at his hands while Sabrina continued her nervous monologue about nothing consequential. I did not stop to acknowledge them. I walked straight through the front door and found Ronald Pierce standing beside his truck in the driveway loading his tools with the unhurried movements of a man who had nowhere else to be. He looked up as I approached, and something in his expression told me he had been expecting this conversation. There was no surprise in his eyes, no confusion about why I had sought him out. He simply set down the toolbox he was holding and waited, his posture open and patient, like a witness ready to give testimony he had rehearsed many times. "You knew," I said. It was not a question. Ronald nodded slowly. "I knew." "How long?" He leaned against the side of his truck and folded his arms across his chest, not defensively but thoughtfully, as if organizing his words before releasing them. "Your wife hired me 2 years ago, Mr. Halbrook. She came to my office one afternoon, sat down across from my desk, and laid out exactly what she needed. She had blueprints, timeline specifications for the hidden compartments. She knew precisely what she wanted and precisely how she wanted it done. The revelation should have shocked me, but after reading Helen's letter, I found I was beyond shock. I was entering a new territory of understanding a place where the woman I thought I knew was revealing herself to be someone far more complex than I had ever imagined. "She told me to wait," Ronald continued. "She said that someday, maybe months from now, maybe years, you would decide to renovate her office. When that happened, I was supposed to make sure you found me. She gave me the name of your friend at church, the one who eventually recommended me to you. She arranged everything so that when you were ready, the path would lead directly to my door." I thought about the recommendation, how casually it had come up in conversation after Sunday service. I thought about how natural it had felt to call Ronald, how seamlessly he had fit into the narrative of a grieving widower seeking closure through renovation. None of it had been coincidence. Helen had planted seeds years before her death, trusting that they would bloom at exactly the right moment. "What if I never called?" I asked. "What if I had left that room closed forever?" Ronald's expression softened with something like admiration. "She planned for that too. If 18 months passed after her death and you hadn't reached out, I was supposed to contact you myself. I had a story prepared about a county inspection, some fabricated concern about the structural integrity of older homes in the area. Anything to get me through your door and into that office." He reached into his truck and pulled out a worn envelope different from the one Helen had left in the wall. This one was addressed to him in her handwriting, the edges soft from being handled many times over the years. "She paid me in advance," he said, holding up the envelope. More than enough to wait as long as necessary. She said something I've never forgotten. She said, "My husband is a proud man. He built his career on solving problems himself. If I simply hand him the truth, he won't trust it. He needs to feel like he discovered it on his own. Make sure he finds it himself, Ronald. Make sure he believes it was his choice." I closed my eyes and let the words wash over me. Even in death, Helen had understood me better than I understood myself. She knew that I would resist any truth that felt imposed from outside. She knew that I needed to walk through the door myself to pull back the curtain with my own hands to believe that the discovery was mine. And so, she had constructed an elaborate architecture of choice-building pathways that all led to the same destination while allowing me the illusion of free will. "She was remarkable," Ronald said quietly. "I've worked with a lot of people over the years, Mr. Halbrook. I've seen families tear themselves apart over inheritances and grudges and petty jealousies, but I've never seen anyone plan the way your wife planned. She thought of everything, every contingency, every possibility, every potential failure point. She built this like an engineer builds a bridge." The comparison struck me with unexpected force. Helen had watched me work for 40 years. She had listened to me explain load calculations and stress tolerances and the importance of redundancy in critical systems. She had absorbed my language, my methodology, my way of seeing the world. And when the time came to protect her family from a threat I could not see, she had applied everything she learned from me to construct a system of her own. I stood in my driveway staring at the house where I had lived for 3 decades, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. The home I thought I knew was suddenly unfamiliar, filled with hidden compartments and secret arrangements, and the careful planning of a woman who had been fighting a war I never knew existed. She had been my wife, my partner, my best friend. But she had also been something else, a strategist, a protector, a silent guardian who had spent her final months building fortifications against enemies I was only now beginning to recognize. Ronald extended his hand and I shook it automatically. "She asked me to tell you one more thing," he said. "She said that when you found the truth, you should remember that she did all of this because she loved you. Not because she didn't trust you, but because she trusted you too much to let you fight this battle alone." I nodded, unable to speak. Ronald climbed into his truck and drove away, leaving me standing in the fading afternoon light with the weight of Helen's love pressing down on my shoulders like armor I had not known I was wearing. She had not just left evidence, she had left a battlefield map, and I was only beginning to read it. I waited until the following morning to open the second safe. Lucas and Sabrina had left the previous evening, with promises to return their departure, hurried and full of half-formed excuses about early meetings and long drives. I watched them go from the window of Helen's office, Sabrina's posture rigid as she walked to the car, Lucas trailing behind her, like a shadow uncertain of its source. Neither of them looked back at the house. Neither of them waved goodbye. The combination to the second safe was written on the back of Helen's letter, hidden in what appeared to be a random sequence of numbers she had labeled, "Our anniversary plus your mother's birthday." It was a code only I would understand, a final layer of protection, ensuring that whatever lay inside would reach only the intended recipient. My fingers trembled as I dialed the numbers, each click of the mechanism echoing in the silent room like a heartbeat counting down to revelation. The safe opened with a soft exhale of stale air. Inside, I found exactly what Helen's letter had promised: evidence, documentation, proof of a betrayal that had been unfolding beneath my feet for longer than I wanted to believe. The first folder contained bank statements from accounts I did not recognize, accounts bearing my name and social security number, but listing addresses I had never lived at and phone numbers I'd never owned. Someone had opened these accounts using my identity, and someone had been systematically transferring money into them from my retirement funds. The amounts were small. At first, a few $100s here and there, easily overlooked in the monthly statements I'd stopped reviewing carefully after Helen got sick. But over time, the transfers had grown bolder. $5,000, $10,000, $20,000. The total calculated on a handwritten sheet in Helen's careful script exceeded $200,000. $200,000. Nearly a quarter of everything I had saved over 40 years of work, siphoned away in increments small enough to avoid immediate detection, but large enough to devastate when viewed in sum. The second folder was worse. It contained authorization forms for the transfers, each one bearing a signature I recognized with sickening clarity. Lucas. My son's name, written in his distinctive slanted hand, appeared on document after document. He had signed forms granting access to my accounts. He had signed letters requesting changes to beneficiary designations. He had signed powers of attorney that I had never agreed to and never seen. I sat back in Helen's chair and stared at my son's signature until the letters blurred into meaningless shapes. The question that consumed me was not whether Lucas was involved. The evidence before me made that undeniable. The question was how involved. Had he understood what he was signing? Had he known that each stroke of his pen was stealing from his own father, or had he been manipulated, guided by a hand more skilled in deception than his own? I thought of Helen's words in her letter. Lucas isn't evil. He's afraid. Fear makes people do terrible things. I decided not to confront him. Not yet. Instead, I would watch. I would observe. I would gather information the way Helen had gathered it, patiently and methodically, until I understood the full shape of what had happened. That evening, Lucas and Sabrina returned as promised. We sat in the living room, the three of us arranged in a triangle of tension and unspoken accusations. I made small talk about the weather, about the renovation plans, about nothing that mattered. And while I spoke, I watched. Lucas could not meet my eyes. Every time our gazes threatened to connect, he would look away, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on the rug or the view through the window. His hands never stopped moving, fidgeting with his watch, straightening his collar, picking at invisible threads on his sleeve. He started sentences he could not finish. "Dad, I wanted to tell you," followed by silence. "About Mom's office," followed by a cough and a subject change. He was drowning in something he could not name, and I watched him struggle without throwing a lifeline. Sabrina, by contrast, was a masterpiece of composure. She sat with her ankles crossed and her hands folded in her lap, the picture of a concerned daughter-in-law offering support during a difficult time. Her voice never wavered. Her smile never faltered. She asked appropriate questions and made appropriate sounds of sympathy and expressed appropriate curiosity about what the safes had contained. But there was something mechanical about her performance, something too polished, too rehearsed. She was not reacting to the situation. She was managing it. I remembered a phrase from my engineering days, something an old mentor had told me about structures under stress. "The ones that scream are rarely the ones that collapse," he had said. "It's the silent ones you have to watch, the ones that bear the load without complaint until the moment they shatter." Sabrina was silent. Sabrina was bearing her load. And I knew with a certainty that settled into my bones like winter cold that she was the architect of everything I had discovered in that safe. Lucas was guilty, yes. His signatures proved that beyond doubt. But looking at him now, watching him squirm beneath the weight of secrets he could barely carry, I understood that his guilt was the guilt of weakness, not malice. He had been used. He had been positioned. He had been too afraid to say no and too ashamed to say yes. Helen had seen this. Helen had understood. And Helen had left me the tools to separate the puppet from the puppeteer. As the evening wore on, and the conversation circled endlessly around nothing of consequence, I sat in my chair and let the silence speak. Lucas grew more agitated with each passing minute. Sabrina grew more controlled. The contrast between them told a story more clearly than any document ever could. Silence had become guilt, and I realized with a grief that cut deeper than any I had felt since Helen's death that my son had been drowning for years while I looked the other way. 2 days passed before Sabrina made her move. She called on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice warm and concerned, suggesting that the two of us meet for coffee without Lucas. "I think we need to talk," she said. "Just you and me, father to daughter." The phrase landed with calculated precision, a reminder of the role she had been performing for 8 years. I agreed to meet her at a cafe in town, a neutral space, where neither of us would have the advantage of familiar territory. She arrived 5 minutes early, already seated at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee waiting. She had ordered my usual black with no sugar, a detail she must have filed away from countless family dinners. The gesture was small but deliberate, designed to communicate attentiveness, to suggest that she cared enough to remember. I sat down across from her and wrapped my hands around the warm cup, waiting for her to begin. Sabrina smiled, the expression reaching her eyes with practiced ease. "Dad, I know the last few days have been overwhelming. Finding all of Helen's hidden documents, the safes, everything. I can only imagine how confusing it must be." I said nothing. I simply watched her, my face neutral, my body still. She continued without missing a beat. I wanted to explain some things that might have looked concerning. Those financial transfers you found, the ones with Lucas's signature, they were the result of some unfortunate miscommunications with our financial advisors. We were trying to help consolidate your accounts after Helen got sick to make things easier for you to manage. But somewhere along the way, the paperwork got tangled up. Banks make mistakes, Dad. You know how these institutions are. Her explanation was smooth, logical, delivered with just the right mixture of concern and exasperation. She painted a picture of bureaucratic incompetence, of good intentions gone awry, of a daughter-in-law simply trying to help her aging father-in-law navigate a complex financial landscape. Every sentence was perfectly constructed, every pause strategically placed. She had rehearsed this. She had anticipated this conversation and prepared for it the way a lawyer prepares closing arguments. I remained silent, letting the space between us fill with her words. The more she talked, the more I noticed what was missing. She never apologized. Not once did she say she was sorry for the confusion, sorry for the stress, sorry for any role she might have played in the situation. Instead, she redirected. The bank had made errors. Lucas had misunderstood instructions. Helen's illness had created chaos that no one could have predicted. Every sentence pointed blame outward, away from herself, scattering responsibility like seeds in the wind. I know it looks bad on paper, she said, leaning forward with an expression of earnest vulnerability. But you have to understand, we were trying to protect you. Lucas was so worried about you after Helen passed. We both were. I studied her face as she spoke, searching for cracks in the mask. There were none. Her performance was flawless, her composure unshakable. She had learned long ago how to become whatever the situation required, how to read people and reflect back exactly what they needed to see. I was watching a master at work. Later that evening, after Sabrina had departed with promises to clear everything up with the bank, I sat in Helen's office and opened the folder she had left in the second safe. Among the financial documents was a separate envelope labeled "Know Your Enemy." Inside, I found the results of Helen's private investigation into our daughter-in-law's past. Sabrina had grown up in a small town in Nebraska, the daughter of a single mother who remarried when Sabrina was 7. Her stepfather was a man named Donald Pruitt, a mechanic with a temper and a drinking problem. Police reports documented multiple domestic disturbance calls to their address. Hospital records showed a pattern of injuries to both mother and daughter, always explained away as accidents, always treated and discharged without further investigation. Sabrina had learned to survive in that house by becoming invisible when invisibility was required and charming when charm could deflect violence. She had learned to read the mood of a room before she entered it, to anticipate anger before it erupted, to manipulate situations to minimize harm. By the time she left for college on a scholarship she had earned through relentless academic performance, Sabrina had become an expert in the art of adaptation. She could be whatever anyone needed her to be. Sweet and deferential for professors who valued humility, ambitious and driven for mentors who respected hunger, warm and family-oriented for a young man named Lucas Halbrook who was looking for someone to fill the void his own emotional distance had created. I set down the documents and closed my eyes. For a moment I felt something unexpected stir in my chest. Not sympathy exactly, but understanding. Sabrina had been forged in a crucible of pain and fear. She had developed her skills not out of malice, but out of necessity, learning to manipulate because manipulation was the only tool that kept her safe. In another life with different circumstances, those same abilities might have made her a brilliant negotiator, a successful executive, a force for genuine good. But understanding did not mean excusing. Pain explained Sabrina, but it did not justify what she had done. She had looked at Helen and seen not a mother-in-law to love, but a model to study, a woman of grace and intelligence whose life she wanted to possess. And rather than earning that life through effort and integrity, she had chosen the shortcut of taking. She had decided that what Helen had built could simply be transferred like funds from one account to another if only the right signatures could be obtained. Helen had seen through her from the beginning. My wife had recognized the mask because she understood what lay beneath it. And Helen had let Sabrina believe that her performance was convincing, that the old woman was too sick and too trusting to notice the predator circling her family. She thought she was the smartest person in every room. Helen let her believe that. I gathered the documents and returned them to the safe, my mind already moving to the next phase. Sabrina had shown me her strategy. Now it was time to show her mine. Only someone who plans stays calm when caught, and Sabrina had been planning for years. The name Judith Kramer appeared twice in Helen's letter, mentioned with the quiet confidence my wife reserved for people she trusted absolutely. I found her office listed in the documents from the second safe, a small practice in downtown Boulder specializing in elder law and estate planning. The building was unassuming, a converted Victorian house with a brass nameplate by the door and window boxes filled with flowers that had survived the early autumn frost. I arrived without an appointment, half expecting to be turned away. But when I gave my name to the receptionist, her expression shifted with immediate recognition. "Mr. Halbrook," she said, rising from her chair. "Please wait here. Ms. Kramer will want to see you right away." She disappeared through a door at the end of the hallway, and I stood in the waiting room surrounded by framed diplomas and photographs of Judith Kramer, shaking hands with various civic leaders. The woman in the pictures was perhaps 55, with silver-streaked hair, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had spent decades cutting through nonsense to reach the truth beneath. I studied her face and wondered how much Helen had told her how deep this particular rabbit hole would go. The receptionist returned within minutes and led me to a corner office where Judith Kramer sat behind a desk covered in neatly organized files. She rose as I entered, extending her hand with a grip that was firm and businesslike. Her eyes assessed me quickly, cataloging details with the efficiency of someone accustomed to reading people in high-stakes situations. "Mr. Halbrook," she said, gesturing to a leather chair across from her desk, "please sit down. I've been waiting for this meeting." I lowered myself into the chair, uncertain how to begin. "Helen mentioned your name in her letter. She said you could help me understand what I found." Judith nodded slowly, a faint smile crossing her features. "Actually, Mr. Halbrook, I was expecting you 3 months ago. When you didn't come, I started preparing to reach out myself." The words hung in the air between us. 3 months ago. Helen had been dead for 12 months when I finally opened her office. If Judith had been expecting me at the 9-month mark, that meant Helen had built a timeline into her plan, a schedule I had unknowingly delayed by my own hesitation. "Let me explain," Judith said, settling back into her chair. "Your wife came to me 2 years before she passed. She brought documentation of financial irregularities. She had discovered evidence of unauthorized transfers and forged signatures. She wanted to pursue legal action, but she was concerned about the impact on her family, on you specifically, and on her son." I listened in silence as Judith described meetings I had never known occurred, conversations where Helen had laid out her fears and her strategies with the precision of a general planning a campaign. My wife had sat in this very office across from this very woman and mapped out a future I was only now beginning to inhabit. "Helen set up what I call a dead man's switch," Judith continued. "She gave me copies of everything, every document, every piece of evidence she had gathered. If you didn't contact me within 18 months of her death, I was instructed to reach out to you directly and begin legal proceedings on your behalf. She wanted you to find the truth yourself if possible, but she wasn't willing to let it stay buried forever." The revelation struck me with the force of a physical blow. Even from beyond the grave, Helen had been watching over me, ensuring that her work would not be wasted regardless of my choices. She had anticipated my grief, my paralysis, my reluctance to disturb her memory, and she had built safeguards against all of it. "What exactly are we dealing with?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. "Legally, I mean. What did Sabrina do?" Judith opened one of the files on her desk and spread several documents across the surface. "What your daughter-in-law did constitutes multiple felonies under Colorado law. Elder financial abuse, for starters. The systematic exploitation of a person over 65 through deception or undue influence. That alone carries a sentence of up to 12 years. Then there's fraud, specifically the creation and use of falsified documents to access accounts that weren't hers, and unauthorized access to financial accounts, which is a separate charge entirely." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "Your son Lucas is also implicated. His signatures appear on many of these documents. At minimum, he faces civil liability for his role in the transfers. At worst, he could be charged as an accessory to the fraud. It depends on what we can prove about his knowledge and intent." The words settled over me like a cold fog. My son, my only child, facing potential criminal charges because he had been too weak to say no to his wife. I thought of Helen's letter, her insistence that Lucas was not evil but afraid. I hoped that fear would be enough to separate him from Sabrina when the time came. "What do you recommend?" I asked. Judith leaned forward, her eyes sharp with purpose. "We don't confront them, not yet. Sabrina's greatest weakness is her arrogance. She believes she's already won. She thinks the coffee meeting convinced you that her explanations were accepted, that whatever suspicions you might have had have been smoothed over by her performance." She tapped the file with one finger. "We use that arrogance against her. We let her continue believing she's safe while we build an airtight case. We document everything, gather additional evidence, prepare our legal strategy. And when we're ready, when every piece is in place and every exit is blocked, we present her with a choice she cannot escape." I nodded slowly, understanding the logic. Rush the confrontation and Sabrina would adapt, would find new ways to deflect and manipulate. But give her time to grow comfortable, to let her guard down, and she would make mistakes. She would reveal more than she intended. She would hand us the weapons we needed to defeat her. "Helen chose well when she found you," I said quietly. Judith's expression softened for just a moment. "Your wife was one of the most remarkable women I've ever met. She came to me dying, Mr. Halbrook, and instead of focusing on herself, she spent her final months building a fortress around the people she loved. Everything we're doing now, every step of this process, is the plan she created. I'm just the instrument." She closed the file and looked at me directly. "We let her think she's safe, then we let the evidence speak." The performance began 3 days after my meeting with Judith. I called Sabrina on a Thursday evening, letting my voice carry the tremor of a man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his comprehension. I told her I had been looking at the financial documents again, trying to make sense of the numbers, and that everything seemed to blur together, no matter how many times I reviewed them. I asked if she might come by to help me understand what I was looking at. I said I felt lost without Helen to explain these things. Sabrina agreed immediately, her voice brightening with barely concealed enthusiasm. "Of course, Dad. I'll be there tomorrow. We'll sort everything out together." I spent that night preparing. Judith had coached me on the details, explaining exactly how to project vulnerability without appearing theatrical. The key was subtlety. A slight hesitation before answering questions, a moment of confusion when looking at familiar documents, hands that trembled just enough to suggest age and uncertainty. I practiced in front of the mirror until the performance felt natural, until I could inhabit the role of a diminished old man without betraying the sharp mind still working beneath the surface. The hardest part was swallowing my pride. For 40 years, I had built structures that would outlast generations. I had solved problems that baffled younger engineers, had earned respect through competence and clarity. Now I was being asked to pretend that same mind had begun to fail, to present myself as the very thing Sabrina wanted me to be. The deception felt like a betrayal of everything I had worked to become. But when I thought of Helen, of the months she had spent building protections, I was only now discovering I understood that pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. Sabrina arrived the next afternoon with a leather portfolio and a sympathetic smile. She sat beside me at the kitchen table while I spread the financial statements before us, documents I had already memorized but now pretended to see for the first time. I pointed to numbers and asked what they meant. I confused account balances with transaction histories. I let my reading glasses slip down my nose and squinted at the pages as if the print had become too small to decipher. She responded exactly as Judith predicted. Each sign of weakness I displayed was met with increased confidence on her part. She explained the documents slowly, using simple words, occasionally reaching over to pat my hand in a gesture meant to seem comforting, but that carried the unmistakable condescension of someone speaking to a child. I felt my jaw tighten, but kept my expression vacant, nodding along as if her explanations were revelations rather than insults. "You know, Dad," she said, after an hour of this theater, "it might be easier if you had someone to help manage these things going forward, someone who understands the accounts and can make sure everything stays organized." I blinked at her slowly. "What do you mean?" She pulled a document from her portfolio, sliding it across the table with the practiced ease of a card dealer. "A power of attorney. It would let me handle the day-to-day financial decisions on your behalf. Nothing major, just paying bills, managing investments, that sort of thing. You wouldn't have to worry about any of it." The document sat between us like a loaded weapon. I stared at it for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until she felt compelled to fill it. "It's really for your own protection," she continued, her voice softening into something meant to sound maternal. "Managing a house this size all alone at your age, It's a lot to handle. Lucas and I worry about you, Dad. We just want to make sure you're taken care of. I nodded slowly, reaching for the document with hands I forced to tremble. I suppose you're right. Helen always handled these things. I'm not sure I can do it without her. The smile that crossed Sabrina's face was the smile of a predator sighting wounded prey. She had no idea that my phone sat in my pocket recording every word. Colorado law required only one party to consent to a recording, and I had consented the moment I pressed the button before she arrived. Every suggestion she made, every subtle implication that I was too old and too confused to manage my own affairs, was being captured and cataloged for the case Judith was building. I didn't sign the document that day. I told Sabrina I needed time to think that such decisions should not be rushed. She accepted this with grace, assuring me there was no pressure that she would leave the papers with me to review at my leisure. But I saw the flicker of frustration behind her eyes, the impatience of someone who had expected an easier victory. Over the following weeks, Lucas began to drift to the edges of our interactions. Where once he had accompanied Sabrina on every visit, now he found reasons to stay behind. Work emergencies, prior commitments, a vague sense of being needed elsewhere. When he did appear, he remained quiet, his eyes darting between his wife and his father with the expression of a man watching a collision he could not prevent. He made excuses to leave rooms when Sabrina and I discussed finances. He developed sudden interests in checking his phone or stepping outside for air. The cracks were forming. Whatever hold Sabrina had maintained over my son was beginning to fracture under the weight of what they had done together. Lucas had never been a willing conspirator, I understood now. He had been a conscript pressed into service by a woman who knew exactly which fears to exploit, and now watching his wife circle his father with increasing boldness, something in him was starting to rebel. I reported everything to Judith at our weekly meetings, the recordings, the observations, the growing distance between husband and wife. She listened carefully, taking notes, occasionally asking questions that helped me see patterns I had missed. We were building something together, she and I, a case that would be unassailable when the time came to present it. Sabrina continued her campaign, growing bolder with each visit. She suggested I consider selling the house, moving somewhere smaller, perhaps a retirement community where people could look after me. She mentioned that the mountain winters were harsh for someone living alone. She wondered aloud whether my mind was as sharp as it used to be. Through it all, I played my part. The confused old man, the grieving widower, the father grateful for his daughter-in-law's concern. Sabrina saw an old man surrendering. She did not see the trap she was walking into. The invitation came on a crisp October morning 3 weeks into our careful choreography of deception. I called Sabrina and told her I had made a decision, that I was tired of fighting against the current, that perhaps she had been right all along about needing help. I asked her to come alone without Lucas explaining that I wanted to discuss some things privately before involving anyone else. She agreed so quickly I barely finished the sentence. I spent the hour before her arrival preparing the stage. Coffee brewing in the kitchen, filling the house with warmth and normalcy. Documents spread across the table as if I had been reviewing them with mounting confusion. My phone fully charged and tucked into my shirt pocket, the recording application already running, capturing the ambient sounds of a house that had witnessed so many secrets. I positioned myself at the table with my back to the window, ensuring that when Sabrina sat across from me, she would face the light while I remained partially shadowed. A small advantage, but I had learned from Helen that small advantages accumulate into decisive ones. She arrived precisely on time, letting herself in with the familiarity of someone who already considered this house her future property. Her smile was radiant as she entered the kitchen, her steps light with anticipation. She had dressed carefully, professionally, as if this were a business meeting where she expected to close a significant deal. In a sense, I suppose it was. I gestured to the chair across from me and poured her coffee without asking how she took it. Black, no sugar. I had been paying attention too. "Thank you for coming," I said, letting weariness seep into my voice. "I've been thinking about everything you said, about the house being too much, about needing help with the finances. I think you were right." Sabrina's eyes brightened, though she maintained an expression of concerned sympathy. "I'm so glad you're seeing things clearly, Dad. This is the right decision, for everyone." I nodded slowly, stirring my coffee with deliberate aimlessness. "I just wish Helen were here. She always understood these things better than I did. She was so organized, so careful about everything." A flicker of something crossed Sabrina's face, Amusement perhaps, or contempt quickly suppressed. Helen was wonderful, she said smoothly, but she wasn't perfect. She trusted too easily sometimes. She didn't always see what was right in front of her. I let the statement hang in the air, offering no response, creating a vacuum she felt compelled to fill. I mean, she continued, settling more comfortably into her chair. She kept all those documents in that safe behind the wall, thinking no one would ever find them. But safes can be opened, Dad. Locks can be learned. She thought she was being so clever, but really she was just being naive. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I kept my expression vacant, confused. You knew about the safe before Ronald found it. Sabrina laughed softly, the sound carrying an edge of superiority she no longer bothered to conceal. Of course I knew. I found it years ago, back when Helen first got sick. She was so distracted by her diagnosis she didn't notice me exploring the house. I saw her going into that office at odd hours, moving the bookshelf, entering combinations. It wasn't hard to figure out. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I took what I needed from that safe while she was still alive, Dad. Small amounts at first, then more when I realized no one was paying attention. Helen never suspected a thing. And you were so wrapped up in taking care of her you didn't notice either. You've always been easy to manage that way. Devoted, trusting, predictable. The words landed like blows, each one precisely aimed at the vulnerabilities she had identified and exploited over 8 years of careful observation. I wanted to rise from my chair and demand she leave my house. I wanted to tell her that Helen had seen through her from the very beginning, that every dollar she had stolen had been documented, that her arrogance had been her undoing. But I remained still, my hands wrapped around my coffee cup, my face a mask of bewildered acceptance. What happens now? I asked quietly. If I sign the papers you left, what happens to me? Sabrina sat back, crossing her legs with the casual confidence of someone who believed victory was already secured. Well, the power of attorney is just the first step. I've been doing some research, talking to some lawyers about long-term options. There are proceedings, legal processes for situations like yours. Situations like mine. She nodded, her tone shifting to something almost gentle, almost kind. Guardianship proceedings. For people who can't manage their own affairs anymore. It's really very humane, Dad. The court appoints someone to make decisions on your behalf, someone who cares about you, who knows what's best. The air in the kitchen seemed to thicken. I forced myself to breathe normally, to maintain the posture of a man too diminished to understand what he was hearing. You want me declared incompetent? I said the words flat and toneless. Sabrina waved her hand dismissively. I wouldn't put it that way. I prefer to think of it as protection. Once the guardianship is in place, Lucas and I can handle the house, the accounts, everything. You'd be taken care of, Dad. You wouldn't have to worry about anything ever again. We'd find you a nice facility somewhere comfortable where professionals could look after you and you could finally rest. She smiled, then the same warm smile she had worn at family dinners and holiday gatherings for nearly a decade. But now I saw it for what it truly was. Not warmth, not affection, anticipation. The smile of someone already counting money that did not belong to her, already redecorating rooms in a house she planned to steal. I said nothing. I simply looked at her across the table. This woman who had married my son and wormed her way into our family, who had watched my wife die while calculating how to profit from the loss, who now sat in my kitchen, outlining her plan to erase me from my own life. The phone in my pocket captured every word, every confession, every detail of the scheme she believed I was too feeble to comprehend. She had no idea that her voice was being preserved, that her admissions were being recorded, that the trap Helen had designed was closing around her with every syllable she spoke. When she finally left, still smiling, still confident, still believing she had secured her victory, I sat alone at the kitchen table and let the silence wash over me. Truth no longer whispered. It screamed, and Sabrina had not even heard herself. I asked Lucas to meet me at the house the following evening alone. No Sabrina, no explanations, no excuses prepared in advance. Just father and son in the kitchen, where he had eaten breakfast as a child, where Helen had packed his lunches for school, where we had celebrated birthdays and mourned losses and lived the ordinary moments that constitute a family. He agreed without asking why, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been waiting for this conversation without knowing when it would come. He arrived after dark, parking his car at the end of the driveway, as if uncertain whether he still had the right to pull up to the house. I watched him walk toward the door. his shoulders hunched against the autumn chill, his hands buried in his jacket pockets. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished somehow as if the weight he carried had compressed him into a lesser version of himself. I let him in and led him to the kitchen table. No coffee this time, no pretense of hospitality. I sat across from him and waited until he met my eyes until there was nowhere left for him to hide. "Did you know?" I asked. The question was simple, but I let its weight fill the space between us. Lucas's face crumpled. The composure he had maintained for months dissolved in an instant, replaced by something raw and broken. His eyes filled with tears he did not try to hide, and his voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I suspected," he said. "I knew something was wrong. The way Sabrina talked about the finances, the documents she asked me to sign without reading. I knew it wasn't right, but I was afraid, Dad. I was so afraid of what would happen if I asked questions, if I pushed back. She has a way of making you feel like you're the crazy one, like your doubts are the problem instead of her actions." He pressed his palms against his eyes, his breath shuddering. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have been stronger. I should have protected you." I listened without interrupting, letting him empty himself of the guilt he had been carrying. When he finally looked up, his face streaked with tears, he said something I'd not anticipated. "I tried to warn you, Dad. 6 months ago, I sent you an email asking if we could meet just the two of us somewhere Sabrina wouldn't know. I wanted to tell you everything. I was ready to confess." The words struck me like a physical blow. I never received any email. Lucas pulled out his phone with trembling hands, navigating to his sent folder. He turned the screen toward me, and there it was. A message dated 6 months prior, addressed to my email with a subject line that read, "Need to talk, important." The body was brief but unmistakable. "Dad, something is wrong. I need to see you alone. Please don't mention this to Sabrina. Can we meet this weekend?" I stared at the message, then pulled out my own phone and searched my inbox, my archive, my trash folder. Nothing. The email Lucas had sent did not exist in my account. It had been erased as if it had never been written. And then I remembered. 6 months ago, Sabrina had offered to help me set up a new phone. I had been frustrated with the technology, struggling to transfer my contacts and sync my accounts. She had taken the device from my hands with a patient smile and spent an hour configuring everything, while I sat nearby, grateful for her assistance. She had asked for my passwords to ensure everything transferred correctly. I had given them without hesitation. She had been inside my email for 6 months, reading my messages, deleting anything that threatened her control, monitoring my communications with the same meticulous attention she brought to every other aspect of her scheme. Lucas watched understanding dawn across my face. "She deleted it," he said, his voice hollow. "She must have seen it come through and erased it before you could read it. I waited for weeks for you to respond. When you never did, I thought you didn't care. I thought you had chosen to ignore me." The silence that followed was filled with the ghosts of conversations we might have had, warnings that might have been heeded, a relationship that might have been salvaged months earlier, if not for the woman who had positioned herself between us. I looked at my son. Truly looked at him and saw not the co-conspirator I had feared, but something more complicated. A weak man, yes. A man who had failed to protect his father when protection was needed, but also a victim manipulated and controlled by someone far more skilled in deception than he would ever be. Sabrina had isolated him, had made him doubt his own perceptions, had deleted the very message that might have freed us both. "You didn't stand up for me," I said quietly. "When it mattered most, you stayed silent." Lucas nodded, accepting the judgment without defense. "But you're not her," I continued. "You never were." He broke down completely, then sobbing with the abandon of a child who has finally been seen. I didn't reach across the table to comfort him. I was not ready for that. But I did not turn away either. The hardest verdict was not legal. It was deciding whether my son deserved forgiveness. The courthouse in Boulder stood against a gray November sky, its stone facade weathered by decades of Colorado winters. I arrived early with Judith, both of us dressed in the somber colors appropriate for what was about to unfold. She carried 2 briefcases filled with documents, recordings, and the meticulous evidence Helen had gathered before her death. I carried nothing but the weight of 14 months of grief transformed into something sharper. Sabrina entered the courtroom 20 minutes later, and I understood immediately that she had prepared for a performance. She wore a navy blue dress, conservative and elegant, her hair pulled back in a style that softened her features. She walked with the measured steps of someone accustomed to commanding attention, her expression a careful blend of confusion and wounded dignity. She had dressed for the role of victim, and she played it beautifully as she took her seat beside her attorney. Lucas sat in the gallery behind me, separated from his wife by the invisible wall that had grown between them since our conversation in the kitchen. He looked pale and diminished, a man awaiting judgment he knew he deserved. Judge Patricia Thornton presided, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had reviewed the preliminary filings and understood the gravity of what we were presenting. When she called the proceedings to order, her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent a career separating truth from carefully constructed lies. Judith began with the financial records. She walked the judge through each unauthorized transfer, each forged signature, each account opened in my name without my knowledge. The numbers accumulated on the screen like evidence of a slow-bleeding $200,000 drained over 2 years through transactions designed to escape notice. She presented the original documents alongside the forgeries, highlighting the subtle differences in handwriting, the inconsistencies in dating, the digital trails that proved when and where each falsification had been created. Sabrina's composure held through the first hour. She sat with her hands folded, her expression one of patient bewilderment, as if she could not understand why such obviously mistaken accusations were being leveled against her. Her attorney objected occasionally, challenged the authenticity of certain documents, questioned the chain of custody for the evidence. But Judith had anticipated every challenge, had prepared responses that left no room for doubt. Then came the recording. The courtroom fell silent as Sabrina's voice filled the space captured in crystalline clarity during our coffee conversation weeks earlier. Her words echoed off the walls. I took what I needed from that safe while she was still alive. And later, guardianship proceedings. Once that's in place, Lucas and I can handle the house, the accounts, everything. Sabrina's face drained of color. She leaned toward her attorney, whispering urgently, her composure finally cracking. When the recording ended, she stood without permission and pointed at me across the courtroom. That recording is fabricated, she declared, her voice rising. He manipulated it. He's been planning this for months, trying to turn everyone against me. I'm the victim here, not him. Judge Thornton's gaze was ice. Sit down, Mrs. Halbrook. You will have your opportunity to respond. But Sabrina could not stop. The mask she had worn for 8 years was slipping, and beneath it emerged something desperate and ugly. He's a confused old man. His wife filled his head with paranoid fantasies before she died. None of this is real. None of it. The judge turned to Judith. Is there authentication for this recording? Judith presented the forensic analysis conducted by an independent expert who confirmed the recording had not been altered or spliced. The metadata matched the date and time I had reported. The voice patterns were conclusively Sabrina's. Judge Thornton then addressed Sabrina directly. Mrs. Halbrook, can you explain the transfer dated March 15th of last year? $47,000 moved from Mr. Halbrook's retirement account to an account in your name. Sabrina hesitated. For the first time, her polished explanations failed to materialize. She glanced at her attorney, then back at the judge, her mouth opening and closing without producing words. I was helping manage his finances, she finally said. He asked me to consolidate some accounts. Do you have documentation of that request? Any written authorization? Silence. Mrs. Halbrook. He gave verbal permission. He probably doesn't remember because of his age. The excuse hung in the air, transparent and pathetic. Judge Thornton's expression did not change, but I saw something shift behind her eyes. Recognition, understanding, the look of someone who had heard enough lies to recognize truth by its absence. Then Lucas was called to testify. He walked to the stand with the heaviness of a man approaching his own execution. He swore to tell the truth, and then in a voice that trembled but did not break, he did exactly that. He admitted to signing documents without reading them. He confirmed that Sabrina had directed every transaction, had assured him the transfers were legitimate, had convinced him that his father's confusion made intervention necessary. He described the email he had tried to send me, the warning that had been deleted before I could read it. Sabrina stared at her husband with an expression I will never forget, pure hatred, undiluted by any pretense of love or partnership. In that moment, watching her watch him, I witnessed the final fracture of their marriage. Whatever bond had existed between them shattered visibly, irreparably in the harsh light of that courtroom. When Lucas finished, Judge Thornton sat in silence for a long moment. Then she looked at me, then at Sabrina, and her voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I've heard enough," she said. The verdict came 3 weeks later, delivered on a morning so clear and bright it seemed to mock the gravity of what was about to unfold. I sat in the same seat I had occupied throughout the proceedings, Judith beside me, with her hands folded calmly in her lap, while across the aisle Sabrina waited with the rigid posture of someone who still believed she might escape the consequences of her choices. Judge Thornton entered and took her place at the bench. The courtroom fell silent with the particular hush that precedes irreversible moments. She opened a folder, reviewed its contents one final time, and then raised her eyes to address the room. "In the matter of the state of Colorado versus Sabrina Halbrook," she began, her voice measured and deliberate. "This court finds the defendant guilty of elder financial abuse, a Class 3 felony under Colorado law. The court further finds the defendant guilty of fraud and unauthorized access to financial accounts." The words landed with the weight of stones dropped into still water. Sabrina's attorney placed a hand on her arm, but she shook it off her jaw, tightening as the judge continued. "The evidence presented in this case demonstrates a pattern of deliberate, calculated exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The defendant systematically drained the victim's retirement accounts, over a period of 2 years forged documents to facilitate unauthorized transfers, and actively worked to isolate the victim from family members who might have intervened." Judge Thornton paused, her gaze settling on Sabrina with an expression I recognized from my own years of assessing structural failures. It was the look of someone who understood exactly how the collapse had occurred and felt no sympathy for those who had ignored the warning signs. "The defendant is hereby sentenced to not less than 3 and not more than 5 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections. Upon release, the defendant will be subject to a permanent restraining order prohibiting any contact with the victim or his immediate family. Full restitution of all stolen funds totaling $214,000 is ordered payable to the victim." Sabrina rose from her seat, her composure finally shattering completely. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice cracking. "I was trying to help him. His wife poisoned him against me before she died. He's confused. He doesn't understand what he's doing." The judge's expression did not change. "The defendant will be remanded into custody immediately. Bailiff." 2 officers approached Sabrina, and I watched as the woman who had spent 8 years performing the role of devoted daughter-in-law was led toward a door she would not exit as a free person. Her attorney followed, still speaking in low, urgent tones, but Sabrina was no longer listening. Her eyes swept the courtroom until they found Lucas sitting 3 rows behind me with his head bowed. "This is your fault," she spat at him loud enough for everyone to hear. "You betrayed me. You destroyed everything we built together. I hope you're proud of yourself." Lucas did not look up. He sat motionless, absorbing her hatred like a man who had already accepted that he deserved it. The proceedings for Lucas were handled separately in a civil hearing that followed the criminal verdict. He faced penalties for his role in the scheme, his signatures on those documents making him legally culpable regardless of his claims of ignorance. The judge ordered probation, community service, and the temporary suspension of his professional license pending completion of financial ethics training. His career, built over 15 years of careful advancement, lay in ruins around him. His marriage ended not with formal papers, but with Sabrina's public denunciation. Even as she was led away, she continued to blame him, her voice echoing through the courthouse corridors. Whatever love had once existed between them, if love was even the right word for what they had shared, was consumed entirely by her need to assign fault to anyone but herself. I recovered my assets in the weeks that followed. The accounts were restored, the investments returned, the house confirmed as mine without encumbrance. Judith handled the paperwork with her usual efficiency, presenting me with documents to sign that undid 2 years of theft and deception. On paper, I was whole again. The numbers balanced, the ledger was cleared. But victory, I discovered, tastes nothing like I had imagined. There was no triumph in watching Sabrina led away in handcuffs. There was no celebration when the judge announced the restitution. I had spent 14 months building a case against my daughter-in-law, and now that the case was won, I felt only the hollow echo of what had been lost. My son's marriage, my trust in family, the peaceful retirement Helen and I had planned together. I had not wanted to be right. I'd wanted to discover that Helen's suspicions were unfounded, that Sabrina's explanations were true, that the family I thought I had was real. Instead, I had confirmed every fear my dying wife had harbored, had proven that the woman our son married was exactly the predator Helen had recognized from the beginning. As I left the courthouse that final day, I passed Sabrina being loaded into a transport vehicle. She caught my eye through the window, her face a mask of cold fury, and mouthed words I could not hear but understood perfectly. "You think you've won?" I did not answer. I didn't need to. Winning was not the point. It had never been the point. Justice was not revenge, but it still left scars that would take far longer to heal than any court could order. Winter arrived early that year, draping the mountains in white silence before Thanksgiving had passed. I watched the first snowfall from the kitchen window, coffee warming my hands, and realized with quiet surprise that I felt something other than grief. Not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it, peace perhaps, or the first tentative stirrings of acceptance. The weeks following the verdict had been strange and formless days, bleeding into one another without the structure that legal proceedings had imposed. I found myself wandering the house at odd hours, touching surfaces Helen had touched, sitting in chairs where she had sat, searching for traces of her presence that time was slowly erasing. The house felt different now. Not empty as it had felt in those first terrible months after her death, but quiet in a way that no longer pressed against my chest like a physical weight. The silence had transformed from absence into space room to breathe and think and simply exist. I began working on projects Helen had mentioned over the years, improvements she had wanted, but we had never found time to complete. The garden behind the house had always been too small for her ambitions, so I spent a weekend in early December expanding the beds, turning frozen earth with a determination that surprised me. I built new bookshelves for the living room, measuring and cutting and sanding with the precision I had once applied to bridges and highways. The work was meditative physical labor that occupied my hands while my mind processed everything that had happened. Each project was a conversation with Helen, a way of honoring the life she had imagined for us, even as I accepted that she would never see its completion. I planted bulbs she had circled in catalogs years ago, knowing they would bloom in spring without her there to witness them. I hung the shelves exactly where she had suggested, filling them with books she had loved. The house was becoming something new, not a shrine to what we had lost, but a testament to what we had built together. Lucas called on a Sunday afternoon, his voice hesitant and thin through the phone. He asked if he could visit, just to talk, nothing more. I agreed without enthusiasm, and he arrived an hour later, looking older than his 36 years, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has not slept well in months. We sat in the living room, the new bookshelves rising behind me like witnesses to our awkward reunion. The conversation stumbled forward in fits and starts, long pauses stretching between sentences, neither of us certain how to navigate the wreckage of what had been. Lucas apologized again, the words worn smooth from repetition, and I listened without responding until he fell silent. "Trust isn't rebuilt with apologies," I said finally. "It's rebuilt with time, with actions, with showing up even when it's uncomfortable and doing the right thing even when no one is watching." He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "I understand." "I don't know if we can get back what we had," I continued. "I'm not sure I even want to. What we had was built partly on lies, on things you knew and didn't tell me, on a wife who was destroying our family while you looked the other way. But maybe we can build something different, something more honest." Lucas left that evening with no promises exchanged, no false assurances of reconciliation. But he had shown up. He had sat in the discomfort and accepted my words without defense. It was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, but a beginning nonetheless. The following week I drove to the cemetery where Helen was buried. The headstone was simple, just her name and the dates that bracketed her existence, but I had added a small bench nearby where I could sit and speak to her without kneeling in the snow. I brushed the frost from the granite and settled onto the bench, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. "It's done," I said aloud. "She's in prison. Lucas is trying to make amends. The money is back where it belongs." I paused, watching a cardinal land on a nearby branch, its red feathers vivid against the white landscape. "You saw what I couldn't see. You spent your last months protecting me when I didn't even know I needed protecting." I wish you had told me. I wish we could have fought this together. But I understand why you didn't." The wind stirred the bare branches overhead, and I imagined it was her response acknowledgement from somewhere beyond the veil that separates the living from the dead. "I'm learning to live again," I told her. "Not just maintaining what you left behind, but creating something new. I think you would want that. I think you would be proud." I sat with her until the cold became unbearable, then drove home through streets glittering with Christmas lights. The house welcomed me with warmth and the smell of the stew I had left simmering on the stove. For the first time in longer than I could remember, it felt like coming home rather than returning to a place where home used to exist. But there was still one room I had not finished, and one envelope I had not delivered. The renovation of Helen's office took 3 months to complete. I worked slowly, deliberately savoring each transformation rather than rushing toward some arbitrary finish line. The false wall was removed entirely, the hidden compartments exposed, and then incorporated into the room's new design. I kept the second safe visible on a custom shelf Ronald built for me, its metal surface polished to a soft gleam, a permanent reminder of the protection Helen had constructed in secret. The bookshelves were rebuilt and reorganized, no longer arranged by height in that obsessive pattern Helen had created to disguise her preparations, but by subject and author, the way she would have preferred in a life without threats to guard against. Her desk remained in its original position by the window, but I replaced the chair with something more comfortable, a reading chair where I could sit and watch the mountains change colors with the seasons. The room transformed from a shrine of grief into something warmer, a space of gratitude rather than sorrow, a place where I could remember Helen not as she died, but as she lived. Spring was breaking across the foothills when Lucas came for his visit. We had established a tentative rhythm over the preceding month's dinners that were no longer awkward conversations that occasionally touched on subjects beyond the weather and the mundane. The careful distance between us had not disappeared, but it had softened into something more like healing scar tissue than open wound. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon with coffee from the shop in town Helen had loved, a small gesture that told me he was trying. I led him to the office and I watched his face as he took in the changes. The last time he had stood in this room, it had been the day Ronald opened the wall, the day everything we thought we knew about our family began to crumble. Now the space bore no resemblance to that terrible afternoon. Light poured through windows I had cleaned until they sparkled. Fresh flowers sat on Helen's desk, daffodils from the garden I had expanded in her memory. "It's beautiful, Dad," Lucas said quietly. "She would have loved this." I nodded, my throat tightening. "I think so too." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and I knew the time had come. I walked to Helen's desk and opened the bottom drawer, reaching beneath the false bottom she had installed years ago. My fingers found the envelope I had discovered weeks earlier but had not yet had the courage to deliver. It was smaller than the one she had left for me, the paper soft from age, Lucas's name written across the front in his mother's careful hand. "Your mother left this for you," I said, holding it out to him. "She asked me to give it to you when you were ready. I think you're ready now." Lucas stared at the envelope as if it might burn him. His hands trembled as he took it, and he stood frozen for a long moment before sliding his finger beneath the seal. The paper unfolded with a whisper, and I watched my son's eyes move across his mother's final words to him. The change in his face was immediate and devastating. Whatever composure he had rebuilt over the past months dissolved as he read, tears streaming down his cheeks, his breath coming in ragged gasps. When he finished, he looked up at me with an expression of such raw pain and hope that I felt my own eyes fill. "She knew," he whispered. "She knew I was afraid. She knew I wasn't strong enough." "What did she say?" He handed me the letter with shaking hands, and I read Helen's words to our son. She had written about fear and forgiveness, about the difference between being complicit and being evil. She told him that love was not about perfection, but about honesty, about showing up and trying even when trying felt impossible. She told him that if he was reading this letter, it meant his father had found a way to forgive him, and now he needed to forgive himself. "Become the man I always knew you could be," she had written. "Start with honesty. Start there." I set the letter down and looked at Lucas. Truly looked at him, seeing not the weak man who had failed me, but the frightened son Helen had understood far better than I ever had. She had seen through Sabrina's mask from the beginning, but she had also seen through Lucas's failures to the fear beneath them. And she had left him a lifeline, words of grace and challenge that could only be delivered after the storm had passed. Lucas broke down completely, sobbing with an abandon I had not witnessed since he was a child. And this time I did not hold back. I crossed the room and wrapped my arms around my son, holding him while he wept, feeling my own tears fall into his hair. We stood together in Helen's office, father and son finally grieving together. Not just for Helen, but for the years we had lost to silence the trust that had been broken, the family that had nearly been destroyed. The afternoon light shifted around us, painting the walls in kit and amber. I held my son and felt something inside me release some final knot of anger and sorrow that had been waiting for this moment to dissolve. Justice had not hardened me. It had freed me. And in that small room where everything began, I finally understood what Helen had truly accomplished. She had not just saved my future, she had saved my family. And that brings us to the end of George's incredible journey. What a story. I have to be honest with you, this one hit me differently. Helen was not just a loving wife, she was a strategist, a protector, someone who spent her final months building a fortress around the people she loved instead of focusing on her own pain. That kind of love is rare, and it reminds us that true protection sometimes means preparing for battles we hope will never come. Here is what I want you to take away from this story. First, trust your instincts. George noticed small things over the years: Sabrina's questions, Lucas's nervous behavior, but he dismissed them because he wanted to believe the best in people. There's nothing wrong with being trusting, but when your gut tells you something is off, listen to it. Second, document everything. Helen's preparation saved George. She kept records, she gathered evidence, she made sure the truth could not be buried. If you ever find yourself in a situation where someone is taking advantage of you or someone you love, write it down, save the emails, keep the receipts. Third, understand that forgiveness is a process, not a moment. George did not immediately embrace Lucas after everything came to light. He gave himself permission to feel betrayed while also leaving the door open for reconciliation. That is healthy. That is real. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Revenge Room and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, justice is not about hatred. It is about protecting what matters and finding peace on the other side. Thank you for watching until the end. I will see you in the next story.